O God, we come before you in joy and thanksgiving. I ask now that the meditation of all our hearts and the words that I humbly offer would bring glory to you. Amen. The Lord, sitting on a throne, high and lofty. God's robe filling the temple. Seraphs flying in attendance, calling, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." The foundations of the temple tremble. Smoke filling the air. Can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you feel it? Smell it? Can you sense the majesty and the wonder of God? Can you feel the awe of being in God's presence? Isaiah has a vision, perhaps through a dream, and experiences the sacred nature of God. And his life is changed, transformed. He leaves the encounter humbled and a messenger of God. This passage is often used to preach about God's call in our lives, especially during commissionings and ordinations for those entering some form of ministry. This passage is indeed about God's call and about our response. But that is only part of the story, as the saying goes. As you experience the story that Susan read for us, did it ring any bells? Was there anything that felt familiar? Well, I hope so. For this passage outlines how worship of God has been shaped for centuries. A hymn of praise or opening hymn, an admission of sin or missing the mark, as Pastor Wes has been explaining it to us recently, followed by forgiveness, and concluding with a call to service and a positive response. It is an order that has been followed in some form from ancient times throughout denominations, from a high Roman Catholic or Orthodox Mass to a seemingly simple, unbulletined contemporary service. It is the form that young Franz Schubert followed in composing his Mass in G for worship at his very own church in the early 1800s. And it is the order that we are following today. I think that there is something wonderful in being connected to ancient practices. I love planning and being engaged in worship. And obviously, I think that there's a great value to worship. But I have to admit that when I read this passage, I think that the experience of Isaiah seems so much more exciting and more dramatic. And over the years, I've heard folks lament about the sameness of worship. Sometimes I think our thoughts and our feelings about worship can be like those of a young boy roaming the sanctuary where his family attended church. As he was walking around, the pastor saw him and came over and started talking to him. And they walked through the sanctuary, and their sanctuary had stained glass windows, so he explained to the young boy how the progression of the windows told the story of Jesus' life. And then they came to one that had different emblems on it, and he explained how each emblem was for a different one of the gospel writers: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then as they came towards the front of the service, there was a plaque there with a lot of names listed on it. And the boy looked at it and he asked the pastor, what's that? What are all those names? The pastor looked at them and he solemnly said, those are the names of people that have died in the service. The boy looked puzzled and went, then he looked worried. And he said, was that the 9 o'clock or the 11? Well, let's be honest. At times, we wonder what it is that we're doing in worship. We question the point of it all. And sometimes we think that we're not getting very much out of it. Soren Kierkegaard, philosopher and theologian, commented on the experience of worship in his day. And I think that it still applies today as well. He said that worship was like a play, or the attitude was approaching like a play, in which the roles of the participants were as follows. God is the director, clergy and worship leaders are the actors, and the people of the congregation are the audience. But what it should be, he says, is that clergy and worship leaders are the directors. The people of the congregation are the actors, and God is the audience. We tend to get it backwards, becoming passive rather than engaged, thinking in terms of what it is we can receive from God, rather than what we can give to God. Yes, we do receive from worship. But as Kierkegaard reminds us, God should be the focus and the recipient of our worship. Isaiah encountered God. He saw and he heard the seraphs praising God. And I think through the music of the seraphs, he himself experienced giving praise to God as well. In so doing, he experienced the holiness of God and realized who he was in relationship to God. He recognized that he indeed missed the mark. He confessed his sin, and he was able to receive forgiveness. It was then that his heart and his mind opened to God's presence in his life, and ultimately opened to God's call to use his life in God's work in the world. So, what are we, thousands of years later, doing here? Well, I believe by following the example of Isaiah and the pattern of worship that has been laid out for us from ancient times, that we are engaging in powerful and transformative work. Yes, work. Our English word worship has its roots from the Greek word liturgia, meaning work of the people. This tells us that we, each and every one of us, are to be involved in worship, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually engaged. We are to give praise and to glorify God. We are to reflect on the state of our being in relationship to God, to be honest, to admit that we do mess up, and then to seek forgiveness for those ways we fall short. And also for the ways that maybe unintentionally we place barriers between us and God. It is through that work, through focusing ourselves on God, through giving to God, that we become open to experience God's presence in our lives, to experience it in such a way that it makes a difference in who we are and in how we live. Oh, Ellen, you're supposed to say that. You're a minister. Sounds nice, huh? But practically speaking, does it really make a difference in our lives? Yes, I believe it does. Perhaps not as quickly or dramatically as it did in the story of Isaiah, but over time, yes, it makes a difference. In the everyday, where the rubber hits the road kind of way. I experienced this firsthand at a young age. I remember as a child going to Sunday school for years. I think at first I went with my parents, but eventually what I really remember is that I was going by myself. And I clearly remember when I was 8, asking my parents after I got home from church one day, why, if it was good for me to go to church, it wasn't good for them, and why they didn't go. And I don't remember what was said or how it happened, but as a result, my father started going with me. I'd go to Sunday school, and he'd go to the worship service, and then we'd talk about what we learned from each. I loved that time with him, not realizing how precious it truly was. But it was 6 months after he started going to church with me that he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He only lived for 4 months after that diagnosis. But before he died, he called me to his bedside, and he thanked me for getting him to go back to church. And he told me, he said, it is because I went back to church that I reconnected with God. I remembered that God is with me. And I know now that God is with me through all of this. I don't remember exactly what conversation went after that, but I do remember them saying, Daddy, what's it like to die? And he looked at me and he said, well, honey, it's like falling asleep. And when you wake up, you're with God in a new way. He had that assurance because of being reconnected with God. And it was that memory of that confession of faith that nudged a 20-something woman back to church after wandering away from God, and then into the ministry in her late 30s. It was experiencing my father's faith, along with reminders and experiences of my own in worship of God's majesty, mystery, presence, and mercy that reconnected me to God and sustained me when I received my own diagnosis of cancer at age 40. And it is why I was truly able to say, as I hung up the phone from the doctor, God, I am okay. Whether I live or die, I'm okay. Because I'm in your care either way. So, what are we doing here Sunday after Sunday? I believe that we are engaging in potentially powerful and yes, risky business. By placing ourselves into the holy presence of God, by praising God through word, through music, in sharing this meal that recalls the gifts of God through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the focus of our lives gets reoriented, refocused, and we can indeed be changed. Perhaps in small ways, but yet also in some big ways. We can be changed. We can become people that have an impact for God that reaches beyond ourselves to another person or persons. You've seen it. I've seen it. You've experienced it from loved ones who have reached out to you, have shared their faith. You've seen it here with the people that are called church here on these grounds. We've seen it in this church because this church has a history of being a people assured of God's love and God's presence. Of being a people who hear and respond to God's call of love. Love for others. Love for the world. You are a people who have responded to God's call to do justice. So this day, may we bring our whole selves into worship and offer our praise to God through the words, through the beautiful music, and the sharing of communion. And may we thus experience the holy, loving, and challenging presence of God, and indeed be moved to respond. May it be so. Amen.